Zoom link provided on the agenda, and you must also register with the clerk by sending an email to clerk@nctd.org with a name and or phone number and which item you would like to speak on. So with that, I will go ahead and ask Suhail Rodriguez, clerk of the board, to call the roll.
Committee Chair Patel.
Here.
Board Member Quirk.
Here.
Board Member Hinsey. Committee Vice Chair Jenkins. That completes the roll.
Great. And Suhail will now provide a safety brief and review evacuation procedures.
In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once clear to the building, do not re-enter unless clear to do so by emergency personnel. There are fire extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of the building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief.
Great, thank you. And are there any changes to the agenda?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay. And I'll go ahead and ask for public comments at this time.
We have no public communications.
Okay. So at this time, we're ending the public registration to speak. And before we get into specific items on the agenda for this meeting, I'd like to outline meeting protocols to make it more efficient for us as we move along. First, hold your comments and or questions until after the agenda item has been presented. And when the time comes for board member comments or questions, please go ahead and raise your hand and I'll go ahead and call on you in the order that it was received. And our first item on the agenda is going to be a presentation regarding NCTD's unaudited financial performance for fiscal year 2022. And Yoon Park Lynch, Chief Financial Officer, will be presenting this item. Yoon, you have our attention.
Good morning, members of the PAF Committee. I will be presenting today the financial performance for the fiscal year that just ended on June 30th. The financial information that's here is unaudited. Our current auditors are currently working on finalizing the audit. So we anticipate to have those financial presentation for auditors in the next board meeting in January or February. Next slide, please. I want to kind of start by mentioning some of the financial highlights from the last fiscal year. We had a positive net operating income of about $5 million. I do want to point out that the net operating income excludes payments that we do on our unfunded pension liability, since those are not related to current operations, those are related to past service. And also any non-cash transactions that don't have an effect on cash and can fluctuate year over year based on assumptions from our pension plan or OPEB plan, those are also excluded. Those are related to GASB 68 and 75. And finally, we also excluded some of the non-cash transactions related with the recent implementation from lease accounting standards. Also, on the positive note, our operating expenses overall compared to our budget were under $13 million, with most of the savings being realized from professional services. Fair revenues were lower by $3.2 million compared to the budget, as well as ridership. However, I do want to point out that we did have a free month of service in September in partnership with MTS when we launched the Pronto system, as well as the start of the Youth Opportunity Pass program that started in May. So all those revenues associated with the Youth Opportunity Pass are not reported as fair revenue, they're reported as grants. So just wanted to point that out on why there's some discrepancy between those two changes. In the fiscal year 2022, federal funding from the CARES Act continued to be significant to NCTD. If everyone recalls, right at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government issued some relief funds to public agencies to support operations directly associated with the impact on ridership from the pandemic. So we continue relying on those funds during fiscal year 2022. And then also on a positive note, we did have higher revenues for tax credits associated with our use of renewable natural gas for our Breeze fleet. Both credits come from the federal and state level. Next slide, please. Also on the positive note is that we had significant capital expenditures in this last fiscal year. The board goal has been $50 million, but you can see that we far exceeded that minimum goal of $50 million. We spent close to $82 million on multiple capital projects. Significant ones were for brand new Breeze CNG buses, coaster train sets, brand new locomotives. If everyone knows, those are the Tier 0 locomotives that are much cleaner than our old locomotives. And we did receive a grant specifically as well from the Carmoya program to fund 5 of those locomotives. We also had significant investments for positive train control, as well as overhauls for our Sprinter fleet. One of the things I want to kind of highlight is that beginning this fiscal year 2022, there's a new accounting pronouncement, which is GASB 87. It affects the reporting of leases, either leases where we act as a lessor or leases where we act as a lessee. I wanted to point those out because if you were to look at the statement of net position, you will see a high increase in the lease receivables. That's directly associated with the implementation of the standard. Basically, what it does is that it requires to treat certain leases as capital. So you have to book those long-term leases as a receivable in your books, or you have long-term leases where you act as the lessee. You also have to record that liability. So just kind of want to point out because there's some balances that on the statement of position have changed effectively based on this new account pronouncement. This slide presents the operating summary on how we compare to our last 2 fiscal years, as well as to our budget. As you can see, we had that positive net operating income of $5 million, and we were under budget by 13.5, with the significant savings realized for the most part from professional services. Also, this is our net position. This is a presentation of assets owned by CTD and liabilities for due to others. Positive note is that we continue to have a positive unrestricted net position, meaning that we have sufficient assets to cover all our liabilities. We are one of the few public agencies that even accounting for our pension liability, we have a positive net position. We have a strong working capital. I think in the final slide, you can see where we are from the cash standpoint and from the different financial metrics. This is the fare box recovery as reported to the State Controller's Office. NCT is required to meet minimum fare box recovery ratios in order to be eligible to receive some of the TDA funding. The State Controller's Office allows the inclusion of local support, which are for sales taxes that are dedicated for transit. In the case of the San Diego region, Transnet is a tax that has dedicated funding for transit. So those revenues are allowed to be included in the calculation of fare box recovery. As you can see, for this last fiscal year, we were at a 33.2% compared to the minimum that's required by the state of 18.8%. And then finally, this is a quick summary of financial metrics that show liquidity for the district. As of the fiscal year that just ended, we had cash and investments of $75 million. Working capital was actually higher. The reason that we had a reduction in cash was because we had a large capital outlays that we had to make towards the end of the fiscal year for monies due that were from other federal and state agencies. So you can kind of see, even if there's a reduction in cash, we still have a higher working capital. A lot of those receivables we anticipate will be received in the next 12 months. And then our current ratio is 2.47%, 2.47. What that current ratio means is that we have $2.47 available for every dollar that we owe. So that is a strong indication of liquidity. We are actually higher than some other public agencies because again, we have sufficient current liquidity to cover any of our current obligations. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm ready for any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Do we have any public comments for this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you. So at this time, we're ending the public registration to speak on this item. And with that, I just wanted to mention that I know that Board Member Quirk has provided a presentation and feedback to staff in advance of this meeting regarding this agenda item. And I know that a formal response was provided. I also know that Board Member Quirk has requested time to provide his presentation on this agenda item. So are there any objections from the committee in allowing the board member to make his formal presentation?
Okay, great, thank you. So you can advance the slide. So my primary concern is that when I viewed the presentation and looked at the numbers, they vary, I'm gonna use the word dramatically from what's in the annual comprehensive financial report. For instance, the full year 2021, we don't have the ACFR for 2022. It shows a loss of an operating loss of 163 versus in the presentation of $4.3 million. What are some of the main differences? Well, we've got depreciation and capital intensive business, and my professional background and my depreciation is absolutely part of operation. That's right in the annual report. And then describing grants, which are really subsidies of operations, but that's also not really reality. Again, that's why the financial report, which I have in all the slides, it doesn't include this in the operating. So I think it's important for the public to recognize. My sense from this presentation is that the operating is positive, but the reality is that ridership numbers are down, revenues are down. I think that the operating losses are 163 million. That's a much closer version of reality.
Next slide, please. So one more slide. Okay, so this is a slide that Yoon just showed here. I won't go into it in detail, but I do want to provide the contrast to the ACFR numbers, which are on the next slide here. So this shows 21 and 20, which I apologize for the small print here, but you can see in the middle, basically it says operating loss of 163.5 million. So again, this is taken directly from the ACFR, the link I've provided there. On the next slide, you can see this is not just pandemic type of numbers. So if you can advance one more. This again, coming from the annual comprehensive financial report, has the operating revenues and expenses, and highlighted in the middle there are the operating losses going back for the last 10 years, 163 million, I think 165. Again, the print's kind of small on the screen there, but in excess of $100 million in operating losses for several years. Again, this is from the NCTD's own ACFR. So, the numbers are, legit and valid. On the next slide here, these are just a graphical representation of the operating losses, again, taken from a few different ACFRs over the past few years. You see 2005 through 2021, but consistent and large growing operating losses now, well in excess of $100 million. On the next slide, and it's always, I think, important to try and keep in context, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to provide ridership for the public. If we're growing, if losses are increasing and ridership is growing, that's fine. That's a reasonable trade-off. But we're seeing these large increases in operating losses, and in the three major modes, we've seen consistent declines for several years. The bus is on the upper left there, and I've broken down with the line there, the pandemic and pre-pandemic level. So, I don't think it's, fair to attribute some of the operation of the to the pandemic. So we've got the bus on the upper left, we've got the coaster on the upper right, and then the sprinter on the lower section there. On the next slide, Suhail, just another note here on the fare box recovery. I just thought, the title of this slide is fare box recovery. So intuitively, it's okay, what's being collected at the fare box, and how does that correlate to the expenses? And when I look at the fine print here, it includes the local subsidy. Well, then what's the point of including this slide? So the true fare box recovery is about half of what's being presented here. So again, it's showing kind of a 32 or 39.0% figure for 2019, I believe. And if you go to the next slide here, again, taking this from the ACFR, you can see that the fare box recovery ratio down on the bottom line there was 5.8% for 2021, 13% last year. And then the last pre-pandemic year, 16.7% versus, I believe, 39.0%. So this, I believe, is kind of reflective of, okay, what's actually being collected at the fare box relative to expenses. So I think it just gives a more accurate understanding. I understand that there's a technical, allowance of having local for getting these state, grants or whatever. But, again, this indicates that there's not a lot collected at the fare box, even the overall expenses. So we just have some concerns overall that the presentation is generally conveying a much more positive financial position, when I think the reality is that the operating results are pretty negative and have been negative for many, many years. Thank you. Those are my comments.
I think I'll take this. Can you give me? All right. I think you guys have all received our response to Board Member Quirk. First, let's just acknowledge, I think everyone knows NCTD is a public agency. And I think for every public agency that I'm aware of is receiving subsidies to support its operations. So comparing us to a private company would never make sense, because by the nature of being a public agency means we are receiving public subsidies. So that's the fact of the matter. So we agree, we're a public agency and we're receiving public subsidies. I wanted to walk through, because there was a number of things that were raised, just to make sure there's some clarity. So in terms of the fare box recovery ratio, so we agree with you about the transparency and reporting, and we consistently report in terms of including the pure fare box recovery ratio as well as the state mandated. So I wanted to make sure you were aware, and I think I mentioned this to you. So in our report, in our quarterly reports to the board, we specifically capture both the state mandated one as well as the pure fare box recovery. Okay, so it's there, it's available on the public, it's on the website, it's in our package. So I think that addresses one of your questions. In regards to some of your feedback about depreciation, I think the clarity is apples to apples. We did take a look, and your city reports depreciation pretty much the exact same way as North County Transit District reports depreciation, because guess what? We're both public entities. So I wanted to share that with you. What is really also important, here's our annual CAFRA results and the clean opinion from our auditors. What I get concerned about is creating a perception that somehow we're not reporting accurately, when in fact, we've had clean audit after clean audit. We've had a year of audits, some of the most robust audits, and NCTD has been found to be one of the best agencies in terms of our financial reporting. The final point that I would make is I really do see my role as representing the interests of the employees. This is a hard business. And I think no one on this board was here when I arrived in 2008, and we had a 5-year deficit that totaled $80-something million. It was the board's leadership that allowed us to really transition from an agency that had no cash on hand to where we are today. So I want to make sure that I just articulate with a level of clarity for our workforce. They have a lot to be proud of in terms of what we've done, what the board has done to help us achieve financial stability. There's no doubt about it. You know, we've had some impacts from COVID-19 and other things, but I don't think anyone is trying to hide from the fact that we're a public agency, that we do receive taxpayer subsidies. Most of those subsidies have been approved by voters, indicating that they see the value in what we do, and that our employees should feel absolutely proud of what we do and what we've done to achieve financial stability for this agency, for which I'm willing to compare with anybody in terms of the performance of the agency from a financial perspective. So I wanted just to put those on the record. I didn't want people to be misled by opinions.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. And any other board member comments or questions? Board Member Hensy?
Sure, I'll just respond to that as well. I think we're in a really great position compared to other public agencies, and it's great to hear clarity on that, and that also we have policies in place that ensure that happens for the future. And so just a little story from my childhood. My parents are teachers. They taught 2 years in Europe, and so we were able to have one car. And that car, most of the time, we didn't use unless we were going on trips, and the rest of the time we could take public transportation around. And when we moved back to Southern California, all of a sudden we had this huge burden of 2 cars. My dad taught in Oceanside, my mom taught nearby. It wasn't walkable. And for our family to be able to buy a house, we had to get rid of one of the cars. So one summer, my mom and I spent a lot of time on the buses going to and from junior lifeguards, and to be able to rely on public transportation for those gaps in our car ownership allowed my family to be able to still get where we need to go, for my dad to go to work. And so we provide more than just the face value of getting everyone where they need to go. We provide options for the most vulnerable. We provide options for those who, can't drive and need to rely on our paratransit services. So it's not just about how much you can afford, how much money we're making. It's about the services that we're providing. So I just want to reiterate my support for that. I do have just a few questions, or actually one. Can you tell me a little bit about the policies that we have in place to be in such a good position regarding our pension liabilities? Is there something that we, just a little overview, because I'm new.
So from a pension liability standpoint, there can be fluctuations year over year. Changes can happen if the CalPERS board decides to change some of the assumptions. I know that the really not just affecting NCTD, but affecting multiple agencies across the state. When CalPERS decided to start reducing the rate on the discount rate on the pension liability, it created kind of this negative impact, because it looked like most government agencies that were not fully funded. But from our standpoint, in the last valuation report, the reason that we have a higher funded percentage has really been driven by the return on the markets. So in the next presentation that I'll show, you'll see that the return on the market was quite high for fiscal year 2021. CalPERS produces those valuation reports always 1 year behind. So that's kind of why you see that higher funded status. But also from a policy standpoint, beginning fiscal year 2022, NCD, we're actually making additional payments to our pension liability. So in July 2021 was our first payment. Our goal is to fully fund our plan by 2035. All agencies have a minimum required. We made the decision to go on the 15-year plan and try to pay out that plan 5 years earlier. What that will transpire is in about $10 million in interest savings. So that is because we are able to, realize significant savings from the operating budget standpoint, and with that excess cash, we are trying to pay down our pension liability.
Any other comments? Okay, Board Member Jenkins.
Found it. I just want to say I appreciate Dan's expertise with being able to look at numbers, and the board being willing to allow him to share his comments. I also want to compliment the staff because we received reports throughout. We received a report on his presentation and have received reports in the past, and I just want to compliment the staff also on the time they spend to provide us and the details and the analyzing what they're given to explain to us further information. So I appreciate Dan's comments and also staff's thorough follow through.
Sure, Board Member Quirk, and then I'll go.
Sure. Just to be clear, I don't have any disagreement with subsidies. My issue is the financial description as a net operating profit. As long as we label subsidies, that's fine. But then we can at least let the public know there's a lot of subsidies here. The problem is when we have a presentation saying net operating income, it just conveys the sense that is much different from what's actually in the annual comprehensive financial report. So that's my primary concern. It's not about subsidies or not subsidies. It's about what's being conveyed from a financial perspective. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank staff also. I know you do an amazing job with over the years that I've had a chance to work with you. I know that I've had a great time learning from you also. So I just wanted to say thank you. And just something I know Matt has to look out for the employees, but I think that we're all part of a team, right? So I think, at least from my perspective, whenever I'm serving on governing bodies, I do think we're all a team, regardless of if we're up here or, whatever behind the scenes. But we're trying to get to that end goal of serving our community and making sure we're doing what's best as a public agency. And I know that you all have the best interest of the community at heart. And so looking forward to, of course, a good year in terms of continuing to do what we do to provide service to our community in terms of ridership and all of that. That's something that I know that the board and others are trying to come up with in terms of how do we increase ridership? How do we increase frequency so it's more convenient? And as somebody who also grew up here, and is raising my son, I think we are going to see a shift in terms of transportation, whether it's now or in a generation. Hopefully when I'm a grandma, I'll be seeing, people utilizing public transit more. But I think definitely something that I just wanted to mention is that it is a very difficult, public service is difficult. And I think it's more difficult for our employees than it is for us. And so I just want to say thank you for all the work that you all do. And, anything that we can do to help support. Of course, like we have some difficult questions sometimes, and we appreciate the time you all take to answer those difficult questions because we represent a constituency and we just want to make sure that we're answering those difficult questions. So with that, just wanted to move on to item number 2. And I think there's no vote required on this item. It's just informational. So the next item on our agenda is to receive a report on the governmental accounting standards. And that's the, sorry, I forgot to mention Governmental Accounting Standards 68 pension plan, which includes the funding status, participant data, required contribution for fiscal years 2022 through 2029, and analysis of discount rate sensitivity. As a reminder, the board authorized staff to implement a lower tier pension and increase payments to CalPERS to reduce NCTD's unfunded liability. The increased payments will save NCTD approximately $10.4 million. And Yoon Park Lynch, Chief Financial Officer, will be presenting this item. And so I know you have the floor again.
Next slide, please. Just kind of a quick overview of what is pension liability. A pension liability is monies that you owe for future benefits plus minus the funds that you hold on trust assets. So currently all our assets are being managed by CalPERS. The net of those two kind of represents the net pension liability, which is what you owe versus what you have. And that net pension liability is reflected on NCTD's net financial position, which it is disclosed on our audited statement on that position. I also want to point out that the actuarial evaluation reports by CalPERS are done always 1 year behind. So for the fiscal year 2022 audit, for example, the evaluation report will be based on 2021 numbers. And it's also important to point out that for the calculation of the pension liability, there's a lot of assumptions that come into play on how those numbers are calculated. CalPERS has a team of actuaries that actually performs those different evaluations. And significant assumptions are both economic and demographic. Economic are interest rates, what are the anticipated salary increases, what are the investment returns, what will inflation look like in the next few years. And demographics have to do with, what's the makeup of your employees by age group, at what time do we think they're going to retire, what is the life expectancy. So all of these assumptions, any change in assumption will have an impact on that valuation report. I wanted to point that out because once in a while, CalPERS may decide, for example, to change the discount rate that is outside of NCTD's or any agency's control. That's really determined by the CalPERS board. This page summarizes the employees that are currently covered by our pension plan. As you can see, we only have 136 active employees as of 2021. And then the majority of the participants on the plan are separated, meaning that they have retired and they are receiving benefits from the pension plan. And that's the 650 count that you see on the top. And then 427, those are employees that may receive benefits, but are not yet receiving benefits. They could be working for another agency or they haven't retired yet. This illustrates our net pension liability in the last 5 years. I highlighted the interest on the pension liability versus the compared to the investment income. And I think that's kind of hopefully answers the question. oh, how come we had a higher funded status in 2021? And that's because the investment returns, 2021 was really a year of high returns on the stock market. So you can see that we almost double the pension cost, right? So $22 million of investment earnings versus the discount rate on the pension minus the $10 million, that really brings your funded status higher. This is really important because investment returns can change. 2022 may be a year of a downturn. So that means that next year you may see the number come down. And it's not nothing that NCT necessarily did wrong, because we continue to pay towards our pension plan. We have met our obligations since 2009. We have been paying our funded, we're actually making additional payments into the pension plan. But again, based on the investment return, that can change. One of a few other things I also want to point out is that the current discount rate used by the CalPERS board for the pension plan is 7.15%. As I mentioned, a high return of plan assets represents future reductions in contributions towards the plan. And for 2021, the market had an investment return from the pension standpoint of 21.3. As you can see, for fiscal 22, that market reversed, and CalPERS overall had a loss of 6.1. This will not only impact NCTD, it will actually impact all agencies that are within the CalPERS system. The sensitivity analysis is meant to illustrate the impacts that changes in discount rates can have on your pension. So that discount rate is agreed upon and set by the CalPERS board. So in the event that the discount were to be changed, either increase by 1% or decrease by 1%, it has a significant impact on your pension liability. So a reduction in the discount rate actually increases your pension liability, and an increase on the discount rate reduces your pension liability. So you can see it goes $60 million one way and $30 million the other way. Currently, a few years ago, CalPERS started reducing the discount rate, and that's probably what you saw. A lot of public agency kind of seeing that funded status funded percentage start coming down. That was directly associated with changes in discount rates. And pension employer contributions by state statute, we are required to pay into our pension plan. Our cost in the pension plan is composed of two components. One of them is the normal cost. The normal costs are the remittances that we make into our pension plan, payroll, each payroll, every pay period. So as employees have to contribute a percentage of their wages into the pension plan, and then NCT contributes our employer contribution as well. In addition to that, we are also paying what's called the unfunded accrual liability. That means that that's kind of the gap between the assets and the liabilities on the plan. Like I mentioned earlier, we have been making those payments. CalPERS has required agencies to start making payments on that unfunded accrual liability in order to increase the funding percentages. The funded accrual liability payment may change every year, depending, again, like I said, higher return on plan assets will make that payment lower. Lower return will make that payment higher. A lot of the unfunded accrual liability is really related to prior service. Current payments for current employees are meant to cover future pension, but several years ago, CalPERS used to have very aggressive discount rates. I think at some point it had like over 9%. As you saw on the sensitivity analysis, that higher discount rate allowed that plan to appear more funded than it actually was once you start reducing the discount rate. So a lot of agencies currently have to cover that gap. And as part of our strategy here in CTD, we have the goal of funding our plan by 2035. And in the next slide, you'll see the additional payments that we're making in order to achieve that goal. Also, I wanted to point out that effective on January 1st, 2022, in order to save on our pension costs, the district implemented a brand new tier for benefits, 1.5% of 65. Obviously, a lower tier of benefits represents less cost for the district since it's a reduced benefit compared to prior plans. So this table illustrates the payments that we have made in FY22. The required contribution was $3 million. We contributed another $1.3 million towards the plan. In fiscal year 2023, which was in July 2022, we are required to contribute 3.4. we contributed another $1.2 million. So this started in FY 22. The goal is to continue making these additional payments and be able to fully fund our plan within a 15-year schedule. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm available for any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Do we have any public comments for this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you. So at this time, we'll go ahead and end the public registration to speak on this item. Are there any questions from the board?
So for my clarification on those years where we are paying additional payments above and beyond our obligation, is that a board policy that we've calculated an amount that we, on this basis, we review how much we actually want to contribute, or is it just staff's discretion recommending every year what we should be paying above and beyond?
So we make those additional payment always based on the most recent evaluation report from CalPERS that illustrates what would that additional payment be. So
that's
we,
essentially our board policy is say we refer to CalPERS recommendations.
that's the current practice.
So all of this came about, was it last year? Time's running together.
2021.
So as part of us insourcing rail operations, one of the things we were focused in on was managing the forward trajectory of costs. And so we, as part of that strategy, we included the strategy of paying down the pension. At that time, the valuation was different because it was before the last year's 2021 stock performance, and it would have cost us, I believe, $15 million more to pay on that amortized schedule that CalPERS had approved. And so the board, as part of that, authorized us to make the additional payments. So there's an amortization table that shows how we meet the fully funded obligation, but it gets updated from year to year. So that's what we're doing. We're following just the schedule of values that CalPERS puts out that would allow us to reach that destination of a fully funded pension plan.
But some years we go above that.
What we're doing, no, so this is our ongoing strategy. So it was, what was the original year, Yoon? Was it 2035 or 2040?
The year to fund the plan, 2035
Yeah.
compared to 2040.
Yeah, 20. So what we're doing is accelerating those payments. And the board authorized us to move forward with that as a strategy. So each year you get a new number from CalPERS. This is a moving target because, as Yoon said, I remember probably more than 10 years ago, we had a pension value at 104% one year. And then as they changed the discount rates, then you just saw the numbers just decline. And it's a moving target. And like at the end, I don't actually think you ever get to a fully funded because things are always shifting. But that was the board direction, was part of I think it was like 3 to 4 different activities for long-term financial sustainability.
Board Member Jenkins?
I have a couple questions. So I think we all remember several years ago where all the public agencies were hit pretty hard with because the CalPERS board had not been too accurate in their assumptions. And so what is your sense working with them on a regular basis? Do they have a better grip on what's going on, or are they than where they were before?
So definitely, they were quite aggressive before. The discount rate was a little bit over 9%. And you can see just when 1% change or how that pension liability changes. Currently, it's the same 0.15%. I have read that they are potential. Again, it also depends on market performance as well as long-term assumptions. I've heard that there's a potential that there may be a further discount on that discount rate. We don't know yet quite when, but there are definitely discussions of making that discount rate lower. So that means that, again, it will impact all agencies, and what that will cause is making the funded percentage even lower and require more payments from agents to fund the plan.
So does anybody track, their assumptions they make in the market? Does anybody look at what their progress is compared to the actuals, kind of, they're more or less their budgeting, their assumptions, but their actuals haven't always hit the target. And so then we all pay.
Yeah, well, and this is a difficult one because you and I, we spend a lot of time talking about, all they're doing, from my opinion, is looking at what do they believe the market over a long-term run will generate. I think if you really start looking at where we are today in terms of this market, one could be more conservative in terms of what do you believe to be the future performance of the overall market. So I think it's always a precarious a process to try to predict. I mean, I think CalPERS, just like any of us, if someone told us what's the number going to be, it's not about the 1 year. It's about what is the long-term run, because you're going to have ups and down of historic market performance. But what is it now? Is it units right around 7%?
The current discount rate that they use is 7.15%.
Yeah. And so if you wanted to,
Yeah.
you could do a sensitivity analysis and drop it down to 5%. But then it becomes kind of, from your own general perspective, how much money do you want to put in? The whole assumption around this is everybody's going to retire at one time. That's not going to happen. So I think, we can, there's a certain level that I believe you hit financial, a fiduciary responsibility. You've been a good player in terms of managing your pension obligations. But then I think there's the other side of it where you're excessively focused in on it, not recognizing that this thing is going to go up and down. But do I have kind of a minimum of 80% funded ratio, and know what the long-term trajectory of retirements and where they're going to be. So it's tough. So at the end, if you want to be more conservative, then you put more money in. But if you put more money in than what you're required to put in, then what are you taking away from in terms of public service that your taxpayers may, would rather have invested in other ways? So it's a policy trade-off.
And then my other question is, I see back to 2017, we were at 72% funded. Of course, now we're almost 82. How does that compare to other transit agencies?
Oh, do we have?
Do we have any idea?
We have the slide. We have a slide deck. I think all of this is backwards information. I don't know if we still have that
Maybe
slide.
you could get.
Yeah, we
back
can.
to us. I'm just curious.
We can send it out to you all. It's all over the place. I mean, there are certain pension plans that are hurting for certain.
Right.
Then there are some that are doing pretty well.
Because this seems pretty high to me.
Yeah,
Even from a
we're
city
definitely in a good
perspective.
place, but there's some that are higher.
Yeah.
And then you have to also look at the base. Like the city of San Diego has a significant base of pension, and their obligation is pretty high.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll provide you that slide.
Okay.
And then
thank you.
just to point out, once we provide that slide, that's going to be because like I mentioned, the pension plan is always reported like 1 year in arrears. And when we compile the information compared to other agencies, we do it based on their audited CAFR. And all of those CAFRs are not yet available for those agencies. So when we compile, was based on 2021. So you're going to see the other 70-something%, not 83%. But for our next year presentation, or once we get those, we can update it once we start seeing those agencies publish those CAFRs, and then we can provide you more updated numbers.
Maybe it'd be good to have the year on that slide that the agency is as of this year.
Yeah, we do. So,
Okay.
but we can always provide a future update once we get those audited financial from all the other agencies.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other questions, there's no vote required for this item. It is an informational item only, so thank you. And then the last item on our agenda will be to receive an update on fiscal year 2024, fiscal year 2028 capital improvement program. And that's Tyler, is it Farrar?
Farrar, yeah.
Capital Program Manager will review item number 3.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Today I'll be giving an update on the fiscal year 2024 to 2028 capital improvement program. Next slide. So just an overview on what the CIP is. It's a financial plan of what our adaptive capital needs are across the agency for each respective division. This process includes reaching out to project managers and division chiefs across all the divisions to define what their needs are and to ensure those needs align with what we call a transit asset management plan, or a TAM plan. Every year, the needs always exceed the available funding that we have. So what's we do what's called fiscally constrain the CIP, meaning that we only fund what our projected budget will be. And this process will include the Capital Project Steering Committee, which is senior leadership and division chiefs across all division. And we evaluate and rank the projects accordingly as this process unfolds. Some of the criteria that we use when we evaluate the projects include the overall project benefits. So what are the benefits for the project, the TAM plan consistency, the useful life of the asset that will be produced after the project is implemented, whether or not the project is previously funded by an existing contract, and NCT is required to honor and obligate the funds to honor that contract. Safety and security. So does a project help ensure the safety and security of employees and our customers? Whether or not it's mandated by federal or state regulation. And then the last two were added recently. They are social equity and climate change. So social equity is does a public transit address social equity by serving low income or minority communities? And climate change, is a project relevant in addressing climate change? So as far as to look ahead on what's upcoming, we are going to present the full CIP to the Board of Directors in January of 2023, and this will be reauthorized in June of 2023. However, after the board approves the CIP in January, the approved CIP will undergo further evaluation by the CPSC and leadership here at NCTD. And this process will include ensuring that what's called a scope of work, or SOW, is in place by April of 2023 to ensure project readiness. And this is a huge factor in determining what projects will move forward or not. So capital improvement program projects that do not have a SOW by April will undergo further review. And depending on project readiness, they may just be deferred to the next fiscal year or removed altogether. But as I mentioned earlier, this ensures project readiness to ensure that we only execute on projects that are fiscally within our budget. All years beyond the current year are subject to change. So we could have projects in fiscal year 2026 or 2027. When we develop next year's CIP, these same projects can be subject to change based on the funding amounts that are projected. And NCD CIP is highly contingent on receiving discretionary grant awards. Each year, NCD develops a discretionary grants program to kind of support the goal of addressing the capital needs across the district. SANDAG, as you know, they are the Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the MPO. They are required by state and federal law to develop what's called a Regional Transportation Improvement Program, or the RTIP. The RTIP is a 5-year program of proposed projects for major transportation projects throughout the San Diego region. So it includes both NCTD and MTS. Transportation projects are funded with federal, state, and transit dollars that must be included and defined in the approved RTIP. Only projects where funding is available, like I mentioned earlier, are programmed in the RTIP. Unfunded projects are not advanced and remain unconstrained. And approved projects are programmed with funding agents, prospective funding agencies, federal, state, or local. And not to get too in the weeds, but when we present this to SANDAG, we clearly define what the funding is for each respective capital project to give them some clarity and give some confidence on to improve it moving forward. So some of the major capital strategic priorities that we have that the CIP will address include increasing customer ridership and revenue. So this includes increased frequencies for Coaster, Sprinter, and Breeze bus services, as well as implementing new first and last mile services. So things such as micromobility, microtransit, improving service quality. So just a better engagement process with our passengers, with new passenger information technology to kind of help them with a riding experience. And then we say service quality, but we also mean that internally. So improve employee training programs for both direct and contract employees. We also want to improve on-time performance. And I'll get to this in a second, but this includes reducing the number of mechanical failures by replacing our existing bus and rail fleet. And then last, we have fund state of good repair and major priority capital needs. These include the advancement of battery electric buses, hydrogen fuel cell buses as part of ongoing bus procurements, as well as facility improvements at our support facilities and maintenance facilities. And they also include state of good repair, bridge replacements, facility replacements, right-of-way, double track, things like that. So this pie chart just kind of gives an overview snapshot of what our total unconstrained needs are in the next 5 years. And this totals $371 million. I just want to focus on the three biggest ones, which are number one, rail transit ways and lines. Like I mentioned earlier, our bridges, our double track projects, both coaster and sprinter corridors, right of way, drainage, track stability, things like that. That's the number one. You can see it comes in at 52% at 195 million. The second one being the bus support equipment and facilities. So as we transition our buses to become a zero emission fleet, we're going to have to make corresponding upgrades to our Breeze Operations West and Breeze Operations East facilities as part of that transition. And then at the same time, we also have state of good repair projects within those facilities. So things like roof improvements, parking lot, driveways, HVAC systems, things like that, that kind of keep the facilities themselves in a state of good repair. And then the same is true for our rail support equipment and facilities. As we expand the coaster fleet, we're going to make corresponding upgrades to some of our equipment and facilities that would need to do maintenance and repair work, as well as the state of good repair investments at the same facilities. So these next projects are going to be sort of how we prioritize and look at the specific projects within the next CIP and why we're doing it. So the first ones total $55.6 million, and these projects are based on committed grant agreements that NCTD has with our partners in state and federal government, or what's called an Exhibit A, which is something that we execute with Sandag to indicate our commitment, our funding commitment for some of the major capital projects that we're both working on. So these include the Breeze hydrogen fuel cell buses, coaster train sets, San Diego double track phase 1, Delmar bus phase 5, and Bridge 257-2, and some of the smaller projects of upgrading the signal system along the San Diego corridor for our coaster trains. So the next set of projects are ongoing projects that NCTD is committed to funding, meaning that there is an existing contract and we honor that contract year to year. So these include coaster locomotives purchase, coaster bi-level car overhauls, sprinter transmission and other sprinter overhaul upgrades and replacements, Breeze engines and transmission rebuilds, and wayfinding and signage. And that kind of goes along with some of the customer improvements I mentioned earlier. And then finally, we have our high priority unfunded projects. These include sprinter overhauls, bus maintenance facilities, another set of wayfinding and signage for our customers, bridge replacements, control points throughout the San Diego subdivision, as well as different facility equipment and repair upgrades that we need to make. There's a little note at the bottom though. So NCD is in the process of identifying savings from existing projects and utilizing unallocated Transportation Development Act funds to advance unfunded high priority projects. So in the event that we do not have savings or can't find specific grants to address some of these high priority capital needs, we would use our own TDA money to advance these high priority projects. Now, these next ones are just some of the major unfunded medium priority needs. These include CP-Song's double track construction phase, which is going to be in out years, Sprinter 50-minute headways, and this is just sort of a project to double track and increase the frequency for our customers that use the Sprinter service, bus maintenance facilities, repairs and improvements, and various bridge replacements, as well as rail data collection to support our coaster operations. The finalization of the 5-year CIP is contingent upon achievement of a balanced operating budget in the next 5 years. And as we're all aware, there's uncertainty in future revenues from sales tax, such as TDA transit, and the likelihood of a recession in the coming year. The state of California, they're developing right now what's called Senate Bill 198, Section 15, which has a goal to provide $2 billion for fiscal year 23-24, 24-25 as part of a statewide goal for transit agencies and intercity rail capital projects. However, there's uncertainty in this funding, whether or not it'll happen, whether or not it'll be $2 billion. So just to give an overview for what this entire process looked like for the past 7 months or so, we held a kickoff meeting in July. Between July and August, September, there was evaluation between project managers, division chiefs, myself, that sort of accumulated into the CPSC meeting that advanced projects to be included in the capital program. Project managers then completed budgets for their ideas in the CPSC, which were then advanced for approval. The CPSC then ranked the ideas in October. You provided preliminary revenue estimates in November, and now we're in the process of finalizing and constraining the CIP. As I mentioned earlier, this is going to go to the board in January, and it will be reapproved in June. So this slide kind of gives a projection, or kind of gives I guess you could say, a trend of where our CIP has been in years, where it was, and where it's going. As you can see, we always have a board goal of $15 million. That's the yellow line. The blue line represents what our actual programmed amount is, and the red line is sort of like what happened during the COVID pandemic, after CARES Act, after we were kind of successful with other discretionary grants. But as you can see, we always exceed our board goals. And the reason that is gone up so significantly is due to California Senate Bill 1, which allocated additional resources, financial resources for public transit agencies in, I believe, 2017, 2018, as well as the CARES Act prompted by the COVID pandemic, which also provide additional subsidy for public transportation agencies across the country. And this next slide is just sort of the cumulative of the three that kind of just shows the average of and the trend of where things have been going. Are there any questions?
Great. Thank you so much for the presentation. And just want to check in to see if we have any public comments for this agenda item.
We do not, Madam Chair.
Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and end the public registration to speak on this item. And with that, we'll ask if there are any questions from the board. And I see Board Member Jenkins raising her hand.
A couple questions on page, I think it was page 11, where you talked about the board goal of 15 million. Should we increase that goal?
I should punt that to Tyler. I would not recommend that we do it. We put that goal in place. I would think maybe 5 years ago. We off of the top, given the large amount of discretionary money that we receive that we now have been receiving, we should be able to over time significantly overlap that. The issue I worry about in terms of setting it as a target is it then can compete with some of the operating needs that the agency will have over time. So I wouldn't recommend at this point in time doing that, but I think you're going to continue to see significantly higher capital improvement programs well above the board goal.
Should we evaluate that maybe in a year or two to see if it should be increased?
Well,
To see what the direction is?
well, I think we can absolutely we can reevaluate it. I think the key piece is that we're well above, and which is the good news for the board, is that means that we're addressing state of good repair and capacity improvement and service quality improvements. Changing that goal could put you in a difficult position if the environment were to change. So the infrastructure bill, as I tell people, until those dollars are appropriated, it's not actually dollars in your hand. Right. And so I think a premature move would maybe put you in a position of having to walk it back. So I would recommend you stay the course, but obviously continue to review all of the board policy goals year by year to see if you're meeting your targets or if you're meeting your outcome. If you're well exceeding it, then you're probably good. The problem is if you were to see us having an imbalance in terms of how we are utilizing the money that we receive.
And then my other question is, I thought I remembered in the past seeing a page that gave us the number of our total beyond 5 years, our whole capital improvement. It was like about $1 billion. Is it still $1 billion?
Oh, yes. And as part of the budget process, you will get
Okay,
kind of
we'll
that.
see that
Yeah,
again.
yes. So this is the 5-year
Right.
constraint that we're required to produce annually. And then as part of the budget process, we give you not only the 5 years that we're required, but the longer term
Okay.
forecast.
That's when we'll see it.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
And also the projects are implemented by standard as well. Because our constraint CIP is for the most part state of repair projects, but those capacity enhancing projects, our standard projects are part of the $1 billion formula as well. So we
Okay.
can provide that in our presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. Board Member Hensy.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Sharon's question is a good one, particularly in light of our hopefulness around the infrastructure bill. And as I serve on this committee and I realize how much overlap there is between the goals of NCTD and each of our individual jurisdictions, and then the overlap we have with SANDAG, it sometimes is, I think it would be helpful for us to have goals for each of those, like maybe even the development of the REC committee, we come up with some goals that we're trying to achieve on behalf of our jurisdictions. Because when Encinitas builds our El Portal undercross and it's $20 million, that to me is a win for our agency as well. So I don't know the right way to visually communicate that, but maybe for the whole board discussion, when we look at that CIP, that would be something that would be helpful for us to see.
And we can get in more detail offline. I think probably, if I, as I interpret what I'm hearing, so this would be, the discretionary grant strategy document that we developed that identifies all of these different priorities. That I believe what you're trying to get to belongs, more likely in that document to align those high level goals, because the 20 million is really directly relating back to NCTD's operating budget and capital improvement program, as opposed to the broader of where these discretionary dollars come. So, we receive dollars that are formula. So the formula dollars and dollars that are committed to us already, that's what the $20 million is. Then well above and beyond that is what we request through discretionary, which is really big. We ask for big dollars well above and beyond what is ever contemplated or discussed within our budget. So I think there's a way to get to what you're really getting to by beefing up our discretionary to capture even the projects that may overlap with community projects, to really defining what what the totality of those requests are. Will likely make it a lot easier for our federal elected partners and state elected partners to really truly know within North County region what are folks looking for. So we can get there. We just need to work together to make sure everybody understands exactly what we're producing, as opposed to kind of a constrained budget document.
I see. Yeah, no, I think that it's important for us to be able to understand, like, here's the digestible amount that we need just for the brass tacks of our operations, but also to Sharon's point, like, we want to be striving to attract those dollars. And so how do we reflect that when we have these CIP conversations? Because, to you in the practical sense, oftentimes we're probably the dreamers that are, how do we get this $2 billion from the state of California all here to San Diego? But if we have these goals and we have a roadmap, I think about it the same way that we might think about a climate action plan. Like, at least we need to articulate those goals and have that discussion as part of the CIP brass task discussion. Even if it's just one slide, I think it would be helpful.
No, I would agree. I just want to make sure we don't create the confusion between, but there's definitely a vehicle to get us there, because you're talking, what is the aspirational goal? What is the totality of the amount that we're seeking over the course of a year? And that is, if you take our discretionary grant program, plus if we were to add what you were articulating in terms of significant regional projects like the El Portal crossing or whatever projects that may exist, Carlsbad, Del Mar, San Marcos, then you would actually get the number that you're looking for.
That'd be great. Yeah. And then just one other question on this page 2, the CIP development evaluation criteria. This is interesting just because I think in Encinitas, we even struggle with coming up with a way to evaluate what projects go forward. And, is it just council member versus council member, or was it actually like a matrix with numbers assigned to things? So I just want a little bit more information about this matrix. Are there numbers assigned to it? Is it?
No, so the matrix is entirely qualitative. We evaluate the response. So let me back up for a second. So when a project manager submits an idea to our project database, that idea goes through an evaluation process, and they are required to fill out this matrix if it applies to their capital project, right? So if they fill in information in that matrix, it would then come to my attention, and it would also come to the CPSC's attention for further review. But it is entirely qualitative, though, in terms of our evaluation for whether or not that matrix or that answer, the response to the matrix is part of the CIP process, though. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of these things seem like they would elevate a project above other things.
Yes.
And so, if you see mandated by regulation come through, then that's something that you'd streamline or get through faster.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Board Member Quirk.
Tyler, thank you. On page 5 at the top, it mentions implementing 30-minute frequencies on the coaster. I thought that already happened a year ago. Is that correct, or am I not correct on that?
No,
wanna take
that's really part of the regional plan to implement 30-minute frequencies on the coaster. So what happened, the last increase went from 22 to 30 trains. So that essentially was ratcheting down some of the major blocks of 90 minutes to 2 hours of where there was not a train. The 30-minute frequencies, right, are not funded. And so at this point in time, it's still a goal. There's still capital projects improvements, but there is no operating money at this point in time to fund the 30 minutes. And part of that, Board Member Quirk, we're going to be looking at how we can get there in different ways, leveraging different resources between Amtrak, Metrolink, and the coaster to get 30-minute frequencies. Because materially, there's the 8.1 money, Transnet money, there's insufficient funding to support that.
So roughly how frequent are they right now? Because, I see the trains all the time.
No, I'll get it to you, but it's not on a consistent schedule that would support support connections.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a few questions also, and then we can wrap it up after that. So just starting off in terms of the the CIPs, in terms of priority, I know we mentioned that there's certain criteria that we look at and that need to be met. And then of course, the scope of work allows for us to figure out whether or not we'll be moving along with it in this particular fiscal year, and of course, funding and budgeting. But just curious, like, after all of that is done and said, how do we figure out what's going first? And, basically how do all the chips fall for all the different projects?
Well, first, just for clarity, the vast majority of funding ends up going to state of good repair. And so with everything that we say, our first obligation is kind of the federal mandate. So if you say we have to do positive train control by law, guess what we're going to do? Positive train control. Then everything else is consistent with our asset management plan, which is a federally required document. And so you put the chips into there. So what they're getting to is once you go through this process and we ferret down, we then try to make sure that the projects are able to move to construction as quickly as possible. And this has been a work in progress for us in the opportunity for growth and development. Because some of these projects are complex that if you receive funding today, and I'll make up an example just to illustrate the point. You may have a project and it's $100 million project, but you're not going to spend $100 million in a year. Right. And if you haven't gone through a planning phase, a design phase, a procurement phase of the project, then it's really difficult to set a schedule and a final price. So what we've been working on under our good, best, better approach to business improvement is making sure for some of these more complex projects that we break them out in phases so that you can have a better idea of what the project is likely to cost, what's the schedule for doing it. The worst thing that can happen to us is to allocate money to you on a project, and you're then just now beginning the work to really define the project and understand which from a market point of view. So that's what's really Tyler is reflecting is that we're really now taking a moment of pause to say to everyone, project readiness really matters. Cash flow management really matters. When we program these dollars, it's very complex because you'll hear us talk about color of money. But when you start weaving together the funding for a project and you have local, state, and federal dollars, there are rules. And those rules are pretty strict. And so if you then have to go backwards in terms of saying now this project is going to go first for this project, or this project that was not approved under the constrained budget, now it's ready to go, or now it's beyond just a state of good repair project is now broken and you now have to do it. So there's a lot of complexity around it. So the whole focus is project readiness. Who can get a project, who can get a shovel in the ground as quickly as possible? That's what the goal is. Who can spend that money? Who can give us an effective cash flow plan so that we can manage and make sure money's not tied up, which again leads us to not being able to make real-time investments that best benefit the district based upon that dollar being available.
Great, thank you. And so there are a lot of different factors, which is really helpful, I think, just for folks to know what goes into that decision-making process, to really prioritize those different projects. And so thank you for that. I do have a few more. I'll try to go through them quickly. I know there was mention of, especially from our climate action goals, looking at assuming that our goal is to get our vehicles to either electric or hydrogen powered. I was just curious if we have an aspirational goal as to when that would happen for our fleet.
Well, so remember the state law mandate is 2040. But we also have, which I think we're going to be on track to meet, but it's going to be beyond that because all of this is tied to useful life requirements of buses. So you get a bus and you use federal dollars, you're required to keep that bus in service a minimum of 12 years. And for us, typically it's 14 years. And so the goal from the state law is 2040, but that 2040 mandate is not the full transition, is that you won't be able to purchase any more CNG buses or diesel buses at that time. Rail, we're going to be coming back to you all with some discussions about what we're looking to do in terms of the Sprinter and the Coaster fleet in 2023.
Great, thank you. And then I noticed on some of the unfunded projects, there was the bus stop repairs and improvements on there. And I know that this gets brought up from the community quite a bit. At least we even, I think, heard of it, a few people coming in with regards to some bus stops throughout the region. So I was just curious, how we could work on making sure that's prioritized also.
Question, glad you asked. So we actually are funding a package. Tyler mentioned the alphabet soup, one of the alphabet soup acronyms of that Transportation Development Act. So one of the things we want to make sure that we do that in particular, we should continue to invest in the bus system and some of these lower cost projects that, like bus stop shape improvement, those are critical projects. So we are actually in the process of putting together a program around bus stops to include lighting. One of the things that I have encouraged the staff to do, and they'll come back to the board for facilities, is for us to look at developing potential grant programs with the city, where we will provide this funding based on their grant application that they develop a project. Some of these projects are significantly bus stop improvements that are on city right away. The lighting city right away is significantly more efficient for the cities to implement it. So we are prioritizing it. So we have a program of about, I think, $2 million that we're going to set aside and try to do an annual to make the improvements continuously throughout the system. $2 million is will go a long way in terms of those types of things.
Yeah, definitely. I think lighting and just the coverings or shelters are something that we hear about quite a bit. And so just wanted to bring that up because I know even one of my first comments, I think when I first came on board, was around that. So just wanted to mention that. And then the last Oh, yes, of course. Mhm.
I think that's a really good idea, and that's something that my council has tasked me with, providing support for structures, shade, lighting, and inclement weather structures in Encinitas. And something that I hope we can consider as part of the grant program rollout is that we invite other partners to help us fund, like if somebody wanted to sponsor one. I know in Encinitas, we don't want a bunch of advertising materials everywhere, but maybe a small plaque, and then they could offer their support for that. So I hope we include private partners for that as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, and my last question is just on SB 198 about the $2 billion. I'm assuming the uncertainty is around the projected budget shortfalls for the state and not necessarily knowing whether or not that money will come in, or is there uncertainty regarding this for other reasons?
No, so the state in their last budget, they put this as a goal.
Okay.
Okay, so not as a commitment. I think the last time we looked at that number, potentially for NCTD would be 60 million if both years were fully funded. Obviously, the state's still in a good financial position, not as great as it was the last budget year, because they had a lot of one-time revenues come in. So as I tell staff, I'm optimistic. We maybe won't get 100% of the goal. I don't think we're going to get zero. So any of it comes in would represent one-time money for the district. So if we were to get, 50% of that number, that'd be a great number, because that would be one-time money that would be allocated to the district. So we're very hopeful. I've instructed our governmental affairs staff to make it their top priority to make sure that we're aware of what is happening around that piece of legislation.
Great. And we wouldn't have to necessarily apply. It would just be, they would go through the entire state and earmark money
It's
for each
based on
agency.
population, and
Okay.
it's already divided in this region. MTS gets 70, we get 30.
Yeah. Okay, great. Those are all my questions. Thank you. And I think that's it. So this is also an informational item, so no vote required. And I just want to confirm, do we have any other remaining public comments before we close out?
No, Madam Chair.
All right, great. So the next scheduled meeting is going to be our regular board meeting on December 15th at 2 p.m. And with that, our meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.